for AWS to work with databases is called RDS, Relational Database Service. And you can see it here on your AWS dashboard, and you can have access to it by selecting the RDS option on your EC2 dashboard. Basically, what RDS is that it allows you to delegate the management of your database to AWS, meaning that instead of setting it up yourself on an EC2 instance, you are going to basically ask AWS to create a database for you, giving it a username and password, replication options, backup options, etc., etc. And AWS is going to create and manage the database for you, and it's going to charge you based on the usage that is done on this instance. So the very good thing about it is that because it's managed by AWS, you don't have to manage it yourself. So a lot of advanced options like failover and automated recovery are going to be automatically managed by AWS instead of you managing the instance yourself. So that helps application developers to focus on development and not on infrastructure. So we are going to see how we can leverage that by creating an RDS instance on AWS and setting it up through Ansible. So the main thing that you have to know about RDS is that it creates actually instances. The main thing is that you don't manage the instance yourself. Everything is managed by AWS itself. The instance that is going to be created needs to be given a subnet group. So this is the option that you see here on your dashboard on the left. And a database subnet group is a group of subnets that spans several availability zones. So this is required for automated failover on AWS side. So the first thing that you will have to do in order to make your database instance work on AWS is to create a database subnet group. Obviously, this is something that you can do with Ansible, and there is a module for that called RDS DB subnet group. I can pull up the documentation here. So this is the RDS subnet group module that you're going to use to create a subnet group. It has all the typical options that you can expect from an Ansible module, and you have some examples here. So I'm going to use this example to build my database subnet group. So here I'm going to, well, switch to a different screen. My terminal. Yeah. So that's my AWS infra.yaml file. And in this file, this is not the most clever way of doing it. I could have used a loop. But basically here, what I did is that I created two subnets, one in US West 2A and one in US West 2B. So I duplicated my subnet group, my subnet task in Ansible, so that I actually create two subnets. One is called subnet and the other one is called subnet B. And then I inject that information into the RDS subnet group module of Ansible to create my actual DB subnet for my RDS instance. So you can see I'm using RDS subnet group here. So now if I switch back, well, I'm going to look at my week8.yaml, and this is just going to run my AWS infra.yaml file. You can see that I created two variables for my two subnets, and that I'm just importing my AWS infra.yaml file. So now on my RDS console, I can have a look at my subnet groups. This is my Oregon region, and I don't have any subnet groups yet. So what I'm going to do now is run my playbook to provision all my infrastructure. So my VPC is actually already created. And I already ran my playbook before to create my 2 subnets. So, well, actually, you can see that it created 2 subnets, and now it's going through the security group for the database, and security group for the DB. Okay, so it looks like I got an issue with my playbook because maybe my security group already existed. Let me double check that. Yeah, my bad. I already had my subnet group created on AWS. Not sure why. I think I was finding the playbook in another window. Anyway, here my subnet group has been created, and you see that it is associated with 2 subnets, one in AZ US West 2A, and the other one in US West 2B. So now we have the subnet group, we can actually create the database. So in order to create the database, we are going to use the RDS instance module of Ansible. And you can find the documentation of this module on the Ansible website. So this module takes a lot of different parameters. The ones that are important here are the where is it? Engine. You want to choose which kind of engine your database is going to run. So it can be MySQL, MariaDB, Aurora, which is actually compatible with MariaDB and MySQL, Postgres, etc., etc. So that's going to be the database that you're actually going to run. You can choose the version if you'd like. This is not required for us at that stage. We are also going to set the username and password for the main user of the database. So this is the master username for the database cluster. And we are going to select the VPC security groups. So pretty much like we had security groups for our EC2 instance, we are also going to use security groups for our database instance. So we can actually reuse the same one. And what is also important is that we can select in which availability zone we want to create the RDS instance in. So here we are going to use availability zone US West 2A, because that's the AZ where we are creating our instance. So we want to make sure our EC2 instance. So we want to make sure that our EC2 instance has network connectivity to the database instance. So in our case, the way our routing tables are set up means that we need to set the database instance in the same AZ. We could change the routing and put it in another subnet or different availability zone, but it will be easier to just keep it in the AZA. So we can put all of these together. We have some examples here, as usual, that can be useful to use as inspiration. And then we can, here, what we're going to do is use MariaDB as well. MariaDB is the open source equivalent of MySQL. And well, it's just plain binary compatible with MySQL. So it doesn't make a difference for our application, whether you use MariaDB or MySQL. So we are going to use that in our Ansible playbook. So what I did here is that I created a task file called AWS RDS. And this task file only has one task at the moment, which is creating the RDS instance. So it uses variables that are defined in other places in the playbook. Your security groups for the database, that's something that you are going to need. And well, your prefix as well. I'm also using a tag for the database instance that uses the same tag as my EC2 instance to make it easy to find. Here, this is just an example. If you use example and secure, actually, AWS is not going to let you set up the database with secure as the password because it only has 6 characters and you need at least 8. So I'm going to just create a seemingly secure password here to set up my database. So if I run this task, I will create an RDS instance in US West 2A, running the MariaDB instance using the smallest instance that exists, db.t2.micro, using 8 gigs for our database, which is way more than we actually need, running on the subnet group that we have created earlier. So this is the subnet group for the database. We are using a reference by its name, and we set it up using a username and a password. So that is the task to create the RDS instance. And now we want to make sure that this task is being used in our main playbook. And here, I'm actually going to use include tasks because I'm using an explicit tag in my AWS RDS.yaml. And this is going to be used for the provision task. I'm just going to double check my file. I'm using tags provision here, so it's okay to use include. The tag will not be copied over, so I can create other tasks for instance information. All right, AWS groups. Let's double check that we have that defined in our AWS infra.yaml. AWS groups app, AWS groups DB. So that looks like we have everything we need. Oops. Yes, I'm going to save this. Okay, so that's my playbook, and I'm going to run it now. Let's say with -b, and I'm going to use tags provision. Okay. Hopefully, I was sharing the right screen. Terminal. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go through the AWS infra file. My subnets and my subnet group already exists. Routing table, all of that already exists, so no change. And here we are going to provision the database instance. So this is a very long task. So if you thought that provisioning an EC2 instance was long, this is even longer. It can easily take several minutes. 5 minutes is very, very common. So don't freak out if you see your playbook stuck. It just takes a very long time. So you can double check on the dashboard of your RDS management console. At some point, you'll see the instance coming up, but I'm going to pause the video and wait for the instance to be provisioned. Okay, so my playbook has run, and you can see here that my database instance was created. Now, if I switch to my RDS console in my web browser and I refresh my database page, you will see that my database instance has been created here, ACAT 4640 DB. This database service is located in US West 2A. In my VPC here, it is set up with the VPC security group that allows access from my subnet on port 3306, which is the MySQL service, and it has the outbound traffic allowed. So that means that we can actually use that database service now to run our application. The most important part here is that you can use that address to connect to that database service from within your subnet. So in order to use that information in our application, we need to get that info from AWS, the endpoint. And that's going to happen through the RDS instance info module that you are going to run in Ansible, and that is going to tell you the address of your database service. I switch back to my terminal. What I did when the database was being created is that I added a task to my AWS RDS tasks file. And this task runs the RDS instance info module that is going to give me information about my database cluster. So now I could probably get info about RDS. Now I'm going to include, and this is why I wanted to use include before, because now I'm going to use include with tag info. And I'm going to just gather information about my AWS RDS. And here I want to make sure that I'm using tags info as well, because I just want to run it on the info tag. Okay, so now that I have created this, I can run my playbook with the info tag, and I should get info about my instance. This is not really easy to read, so I'm going to use debug to make my life a little bit easier. So here I'm just going to add debug RDS info, and I'm going to debug var, how did I call it? Info, I guess. So I called it AWS RDS info. All right. So I want to make sure that I run this task with the info tag. Okay. If I run this, I will have a much nicer output, hopefully. Okay. So that's the output that I get back. This is the whole data that I get back from my RDS instance info module. The important bit here is the instances bit, which is a list. We only have one instance with that name, so we are going to take the first one. And then this is a complex object with lots of information. And what we are interested in is endpoint. And inside the endpoint, we have address, which is the actual address that we can use to connect to our database cluster. So just to make this very nice, I'm going to do that db address AWS RDS info dot instances, the first one, dot endpoint dot address. There's something wrong in my string, it seems. Nope. Okay. Okay, so that's my database address here, ACIT, whatever. So this is the address that we want to use in our application to make sure that we use that database service. So now what I'm going to do is make sure that I can create an EC2 instance. So what I did is that I reused my AWS EC2.yaml, made sure that I was only creating one instance, because the database instance is managed by RDS. So I'm just using an EC2 instance here, the app, in the correct subnet and whatnot. And I added this in my week 8 playbook. So now if I run my provisioning playbook, I should also get an EC2 instance on top of the rest that I already created. That might take a little bit of time as well, so I'm going to pause the video for the duration of the instance creation. Okay, so I've just completed running the playbook. I've created one instance on AWS on top of my RDS instance. And this is the instance that is going to be used to provision the application, obviously. Here, I can double check that it does show up in my inventory. I have it here. I don't have a service DB anymore because obviously I'm just using one application instance, and there is no EC2 instance tagged with DB, which is what I want. But here I can apply my provisioning to this service app group. So I'm going to grab my application files from last week, put them in this folder, and then change the playbook to make sure that I'm using my new RDS instance instead of the previous one. I've just made a few changes to my playbook. In my week 8, I added the bit where I run my application.yaml. So you can see that at the very bottom of the file. So I'm using the import tasks here because it's a bunch of tasks that are untagged. So I can just use import tasks. What's really, really important is that I defined variables. So here I define variables for my database configuration. And obviously I made sure that these settings match the settings that I set up in my RDS instance. And then the other thing that I'm doing is that I'm using the setFact module in Ansible, which allows me to define a new variable in my play. And here I'm going to define the DB host variable, which is going to be a shortcut to this endpoint address that I obtained earlier in my playbook. So here I also changed my application.yaml. And what I did is that wherever I was using my SQL query in my playbook, I made sure that I was using the actual parameters to connect to the database. So here, DB host, DB username, DB password, and DB name for the database name. I'm also using a template for the backend.conf configuration file of the application, which you can see here. And this template is obviously reusing these variables that we have defined. I have this backend.conf. So here, this is the backend.conf that I got from the application. And then, as you remember, the template module allows you to copy a file while replacing the variables. So here I'm using that to make sure that I replace variables in my configuration file according to my needs. And now, if I didn't test that yet, so I'm going to run it with -v and ensure that I provision everything. I'm probably going to pause the video as well because it's not really interesting. And my playbook just finished running. There was a small issue with a variable that was not defined because I forgot to use provision tag on the info for my RDS instance. But after I run it again, it went fine. As you can see here, I set up my backend to actually connect to my RDS instance. So my RDS instance was completely empty and didn't have any entries yet. But after running the playbook, one entry was added to the database. I also opened an SSH connection to the machine and run a select statement on MySQL. So you can see here that I'm connected to MySQL, the MySQL cluster, the RDS instance. And when I do my select statement, I do see my entries in the database. And when I load the website from my browser, you can see that I have the name that is displayed here, which means that the playbook worked as expected. So now what I could do is just work a little bit on my playbook, improve it, make sure that all the variables are shared between the plays. So there are no mismatches between the database username and the database password, for instance, on both sides. Clean it up a little bit, and everything should be working. Next week, we are going to expand on these playbooks, and we're going